503 years before Christopher Columbus claimed to have discovered the New World, Norse warriors were already forging iron tools on American soil, their hammers ringing through forests that Europeans supposedly had never seen. But this is not the story they teach in schools. This is not the narrative that built empires. This is the forbidden truth that has been buried beneath 5 centuries of lies, suppressed by institutions that profit from ignorance and hidden from a world that deserves to know its real history. What if everything you learned about the discovery of America was deliberately fabricated? What if the very foundations of European colonial history rest on a conspiracy so vast, so carefully orchestrated, that it has fooled generations of scholars? What if academic institutions, religious authorities, and government agencies have spent centuries systematically destroying evidence that threatens their carefully constructed myths? Tonight we will uncover evidence so compelling, so thoroughly documented, that you will question not just who discovered America, but why the truth has been so viciously suppressed. We will follow a trail of archaeological evidence, linguistic clues, and technological secrets that leads from the windswept shores of Newfoundland to the marble halls of the Vatican, from ancient runic inscriptions to modern military laboratories where crystalline navigation technology remains classified. The salt spray stings your face as waves crash against granite cliffs. The wind carries the acrid smell of peat smoke and the metallic tang of freshly worked iron. In this desolate landscape at the edge of the known world, Norse explorers built structures that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about European contact with the Americas. But what they discovered here was just the beginning of a story that powerful forces have spent centuries trying to erase. Are you ready to learn the truth they fear? On a fog-shrouded morning in August 1960, Anne Stein Ingstad stepped off a government medical boat onto the rocky shore of northern Newfoundland, carrying with her an obsession that had consumed her for decades. The Norwegian archaeologist had spent years studying ancient Icelandic texts, convinced that somewhere in this harsh landscape lay proof of the greatest cover-up in historical academia. The village of Lens aux Meadows clung to the coastline like a stubborn barnacle, its handful of wooden houses defying the Atlantic's fury. Population less than 70 souls who had no idea they were about to become witnesses to a discovery that would shake the foundations of accepted history. Anne Stein and her explorer husband Helge had traveled thousands of miles based on nothing more than medieval texts that mainstream scholars dismissed as fantasy. But Anne Stein knew something others refused to acknowledge. The sagas weren't fairy tales. They were historical records written by people who had walked on American soil 5 centuries before Columbus was born. The saga of the Greenlanders spoke of Leif Erikson's journey to a land called Vinland, where wild grapes grew and salmon filled the rivers. The saga of Eric the Red described 3 distinct territories beyond Greenland: Helluland, the land of flat stones; Markland, the forest land; and Vinland, where Norse explorers built houses and spent the winter. For decades, scholars had relegated these accounts to the realm of mythology, claiming they were too vague, too contradictory, too convenient to be real. George Decker, a local fisherman with weathered hands and salt-stained boots, led the Ingstads to a series of overgrown mounds near his village. The old Indian camp, he called it, pointing to rectangular depressions in the earth that generations of locals had largely ignored. But Anne Stein's trained eye saw something different. The shapes were too regular, too purposeful. They looked like the foundations of buildings she had excavated in Greenland and Iceland. As her trowel first bit into the ancient soil, Anne Stein felt the electric thrill of discovery. Beneath centuries of accumulated earth lay stones arranged in patterns that made her heart race. These weren't random rock piles or natural formations. They were the carefully laid foundations of structures built by human hands over 1,000 years ago. What emerged from that first excavation season would revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian history. 8 building foundations emerged from the earth, including a massive longhouse stretching over 90 feet in length. The construction techniques were unmistakably Norse timber-framed structures with walls of turf cut from nearby bogs, identical to buildings found across Viking-age Scandinavia. But the real proof lay in the artifacts. Iron nails that could only have been produced by European metalworking techniques. A bronze ring pin of a type used throughout the Viking world, adopted from Ireland, where Norse raiders had established settlements in the 9th century. A soapstone spindle whorl for spinning yarn bearing tool marks consistent with Scandinavian craftsmanship. A piece of jasper that had been struck by steel to create sparks, the ancient equivalent of a lighter. Most intriguing of all were the fragments of butternut shells scattered throughout the site. Butternuts don't grow in Newfoundland. The nearest butternut trees were hundreds of miles to the south in what is now New Brunswick. These shells were proof that the Norse hadn't simply built a single isolated outpost and fled. They had explored far beyond this northern settlement, venturing deep into the North American continent. The mainstream archaeological community's reaction was swift and brutal. How convenient, they said, that this discovery came just as Viking romanticism was sweeping through Scandinavian American communities. How suspicious that untrained fishermen had somehow overlooked evidence that professional archaeologists could immediately identify. Wasn't it curious that this site emerged during an era when every immigrant group was desperately seeking to establish their pre-Columbian credentials? But Anne Stein had the evidence, and evidence doesn't lie. Carbon dating placed the site's occupation between 990 and 1050 CE with a mean date of 1014 CE. Tree ring analysis of worked wood fragments confirmed construction in 1021 CE, the exact year when a documented cosmic ray event left its signature in wood fibers around the world. This wasn't guesswork or wishful thinking. This was scientific proof that Europeans had established a settlement in North America precisely when the Sagas claimed they had. Yet even as UNESCO designated Meadows a World Heritage Site in 1978, acknowledging it as the earliest evidence of European settlement in the New World, a disturbing question remained. If Norse explorers had reached America around 1000 CE, why was there only one confirmed site? The Sagas described extensive exploration, multiple voyages and encounters with indigenous peoples across a vast territory. Where was the rest of the evidence? The answer to that question would lead down a rabbit hole of academic suppression, institutional cover-ups, and deliberate misdirection that continues to this day. But first we need to understand what the Sagas really tell us about Norse exploration of America and why their revelations were so dangerous that they had to be discredited. What they found next would challenge everything we thought we knew about European contact with the Americas. And what they discovered about the systematic suppression of that evidence would reveal a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of academic, religious, and political power. In the smoky interior of an Icelandic longhouse during the harsh winter of 1230, an elderly storyteller named Snorri Sturluson picked up his quill pen and began transcribing stories that had been passed down through 8 generations of oral tradition. The tales he recorded in his Heimskringla would preserve accounts of Norse voyages to lands beyond the Western Sea voyages that academic orthodoxy now insists must be fiction. But what if they're not fiction? What if these medieval manuscripts contain detailed navigation instructions accurate geographical descriptions and precise historical records that have been systematically dismissed because they threaten the foundational myths of European colonialism. The Saga of the Greenlanders describes Leif Erikson's voyage around the year 1000 CE with the kind of specific detail that comes from first-hand experience or carefully preserved oral tradition. The saga tells us that Leif sailed from Greenland with a crew of 35 men following a route that took him past two distinct landmasses before reaching Vinland. These lands were given names that reflected their characteristics: Helluland, meaning slab land or land of flat stones, likely corresponding to Baffin Island, and Markland, meaning forest land, probably the coast of Labrador. When Leif's expedition reached Vinland, they found a land so rich in resources that they decided to winter there. The saga describes houses built by the Norse rivers, teeming with salmon, larger than any they had seen in Greenland or Iceland, and vast meadows where cattle could graze. Most famously, they found grapes growing wild, leading to the name Vinland, which scholars have traditionally interpreted as wineland. But here's where the story becomes more complex and more troubling for those who prefer their history neat and simple. The saga of Eric the Red, written independently but describing the same events, provides different details about some aspects of Norse exploration while confirming others. This isn't the kind of mythological consistency we'd expect from pure fantasy. This is the messy overlap of different eyewitness accounts, describing real events from different perspectives. The sagas describe multiple voyages to North America spanning several decades. After Leif's initial exploration, his brother Thorvald led a second expedition that ended tragically when Thorvald was killed in a conflict with indigenous peoples the Norse called Skraelings. A third expedition was led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, who brought livestock and attempted to establish a permanent colony. This mission included the first European child born in North America, Snorri Thorfinnsson, born around 1004 CE. What makes these accounts particularly credible is their unflinching description of failure. Unlike the triumphant propaganda we might expect from fabricated exploration stories, the sagas honestly describe the challenges and ultimate abandonment of Norse attempts at American colonization. They detail conflicts with indigenous peoples who proved to be formidable opponents, problems with supply lines stretching across the North Atlantic, and internal disputes among the colonists themselves. The sagas also preserve details that demonstrate intimate knowledge of North American geography and ecology. They describe the behavior of whales in North American waters, the migration patterns of birds, the types of trees found in different regions, and the characteristics of tides along the eastern seaboard. This isn't the vague, mystical geography of fantasy literature. This is the practical knowledge of people who had actually been there. Perhaps most significantly, the sagas describe ongoing contact between Greenland and North America that extended far beyond Leif Erikson's initial voyage. They mention regular expeditions to Markland to harvest timber, a resource desperately needed in tree-poor Greenland and Iceland. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements confirms the presence of North American wood species that could only have been obtained through transatlantic voyages. But if the sagas are accurate historical records, why have they been systematically dismissed by mainstream academia? Why are students taught that Norse exploration of America was limited to a single brief settlement at Lens aux Meadows, when the historical sources describe extensive ongoing contact? The answer lies in the implications of taking the sagas seriously. If Norse exploration of North America was as extensive as the sagas suggest, it fundamentally challenges the narrative of European discovery and colonization that justified centuries of political and religious expansion. It raises uncomfortable questions about the legal and moral foundations of European claims to American territory. And it suggests that our understanding of pre-Columbian North America has been deliberately distorted to serve the interests of colonial powers. Consider the political context in which Saga scholarship developed. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, when most critical analysis of these texts was conducted, European powers were still actively engaged in colonial expansion around the world. Academic institutions were funded by governments and religious organizations, with strong investments in the mythology of European discovery and civilizing missions. In this environment, scholars had strong incentives to dismiss evidence of earlier European contact with the Americas. Acknowledging extensive Norse exploration would complicate claims of European discovery, potentially undermining the legal and moral justifications for colonial occupation. It was far more convenient to treat the sagas as interesting folklore rather than historical records. This systematic dismissal became so entrenched in academic orthodoxy that even the discovery of Lens aux Meadows failed to fully rehabilitate saga scholarship. Instead of acknowledging that the sagas might be accurate about other aspects of Norse exploration, most historians simply accepted Lens aux Meadows as an isolated anomaly, the exception that proved the rule about the mythological nature of saga accounts. But what if that interpretation is wrong? What if Lens aux Meadows isn't an isolated settlement, but rather the only Norse American site that has been properly excavated and publicized? What if there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of other Norse sites scattered across eastern North America, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists brave enough to challenge academic orthodoxy? The answers to these questions would lead investigators into a web of academic politics, institutional suppression, and deliberate misdirection that reveals the saga dismissal as part of a much larger pattern of historical manipulation. But first, we need to examine the mysterious case of America's most controversial artifact, a runic inscription that either proves extended Norse exploration of North America or represents the most sophisticated archaeological hoax in American history. In the sterile conference room of a prestigious university, Dr. Birgitta Wallace faced a career-defining moment. It was 1982, and the Swedish-born archaeologist had just presented 18 years of research supporting the authenticity of Norse exploration beyond Lens aux Meadows. The response from her colleagues was swift, brutal, and devastating. One by one, her supposed peers rose to dismantle not just her evidence, but her professional credibility. Her funding dried up within months. Her graduate students were quietly encouraged to find other advisors. Her invitations to academic conferences suddenly stopped arriving. Birgitta Wallace's persecution exemplifies a pattern of academic suppression that has silenced generations of researchers who dared to challenge the orthodox narrative of European contact with the Americas. For over 50 years, Wallace served as the custodian of Lens aux Meadows, accumulating evidence that the site was just one small piece of a much larger Norse presence in North America. But when she tried to share that evidence with the broader academic community, she discovered that certain truths are too dangerous to speak. The mechanisms of academic suppression are subtle but devastatingly effective. Young scholars quickly learn that certain research directions are career killers. Funding agencies mysteriously reject proposals that challenge established narratives. Peer reviewers find excuses to block publication of controversial findings. Senior academics use their influence to ensure that dissenting voices never reach positions of authority within their institutions. This isn't accidental. This isn't the natural result of scholarly skepticism. This is a deliberate system designed to protect certain historical narratives from challenge regardless of what the evidence actually shows. Consider the response to radiocarbon dating, that confirmed the 1021 CE date for Norse presence at Lens aux Meadows. Rather than celebrating this scientific vindication of saga chronology, most historians simply acknowledged the date while continuing to insist that Norse exploration was limited to this single site. When pressed about the clear contradiction between the precision of saga dating and the supposed mythological nature of saga geography, academic responses become evasive and defensive. The 2021 study published in Nature that used cosmic ray data to pinpoint Norse presence to exactly 1021 CE should have been a watershed moment for saga scholarship. The cosmic ray spike of 993 CE left a distinctive signature in wood cells around the world, providing an absolute chronological marker that is impossible to fake or misinterpret. When researchers found this signature in worked wood at Lens aux Meadows, they proved that the sagas were accurate not just to the year, but potentially to the season. Yet, instead of prompting a wholesale reevaluation of saga credibility, this scientific breakthrough was treated as an interesting technical footnote. The same academic community that had spent decades dismissing the sagas as unreliable suddenly found ways to accept their chronological accuracy, while maintaining that their geographical descriptions must still be fantasy. This selective acceptance reveals the fundamental dishonesty of the academic suppression system. Evidence that supports established narratives is embraced and celebrated. Evidence that challenges those narratives is ignored, minimized, or attacked, regardless of its scientific validity. The career of Anne Stein Ingstad illustrates both the power of this suppression system and the courage required to challenge it. When Ingstad first announced the discovery of Lens aux Meadows in 1961, the archaeological establishment's initial response was devastating. Senior scholars dismissed her findings as the delusions of an amateur despite her extensive training and experience. Peer review processes were weaponized to prevent publication of her results. Academic conferences refused to provide platforms for presenting her evidence. Only years of persistence combined with mounting physical evidence that could not be ignored eventually forced acknowledgement of Ingstad's discovery. But even then, the academic community carefully limited the implications of Lens aux Meadows, insisting that it must be an isolated anomaly, rather than evidence of extensive Norse exploration. The suppression of Norse American research becomes even more disturbing when we examine the institutional forces driving it. Universities depend on funding from government agencies and private foundations that have strong interests in maintaining certain historical narratives. Research that challenges the foundational myths of European colonialism threatens the ideological frameworks that justify contemporary political and economic arrangements. Religious institutions have their own reasons for suppressing evidence of pre-Columbian European contact with the Americas. The Catholic Church has invested centuries of theological development in the idea that Columbus's voyage represented a divinely guided expansion of Christian civilization into pagan lands. Acknowledging extensive earlier Norse exploration, particularly by people who were only superficially Christianized, undermines this theological narrative. Government agencies, particularly in countries built on European colonial expansion, have obvious reasons to discourage research that might complicate their legal and moral claims to territory. If Europeans were already present in North America before the Age of Discovery, it becomes much harder to justify the displacement and destruction of indigenous peoples as the inevitable result of first contact between civilized and primitive societies. These institutional pressures create a self-reinforcing system of suppression. Young scholars learn to avoid research topics that might jeopardize their careers. Senior academics use their gatekeeping power to block research that threatens their own career investments in orthodox narratives. Funding agencies develop criteria that systematically exclude controversial research proposals. The result is an academic environment where evidence of Norse exploration beyond Lens aux Meadows is either ignored or actively suppressed. Artifacts that suggest Norse presence in other parts of North America are dismissed as hoaxes without proper investigation. Archaeological sites that might contain Norse remains are avoided by researchers who understand the career risks of challenging established narratives. This systematic suppression has created a massive gap in our understanding of pre-Columbian North American history. We know from the Sagas that Norse exploration extended far beyond Newfoundland. We know from archaeological evidence that Norse explorers had the technology and motivation to establish settlements throughout eastern North America. We know from environmental evidence that climate conditions during the medieval warm period would have supported extensive Norse exploration and settlement. Yet we're supposed to believe that in over a century of archaeological investigation, researchers have found only one Norse site in all of North America. This statistical impossibility is the direct result of institutional forces that prevent honest investigation of Norse American history. The most disturbing aspect of this suppression is its ongoing nature. Even today, researchers who suggest extensive Norse exploration of North America face career consequences. Archaeological sites that might contain Norse remains are kept off limits to investigators who might find inconvenient evidence. Academic journals continue to reject papers that challenge orthodox narratives about European contact with the Americas. This suppression has robbed humanity of its true history. Somewhere in the forests of eastern North America lie the ruins of Norse settlements that could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian civilization. Somewhere in museum collections sit artifacts that could prove extensive transatlantic contact centuries before Columbus. Somewhere in archives rest documents that could reveal the full extent of the conspiracy to hide Norse American history. But these treasures remain buried beneath layers of academic orthodoxy, institutional corruption, and deliberate misdirection. The question is whether we're willing to dig deep enough to uncover them, regardless of what powerful forces might prefer to keep them hidden. The story of Norse exploration doesn't end with Lens aux Meadows. It doesn't even begin there. What we're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between Europe and America, revealing a pattern of contact and influence that powerful institutions have spent centuries trying to erase. On a crisp autumn morning in 1898, Swedish immigrant Olof Oman was clearing land on his farm near Kensington, Minnesota, when his axe struck something harder than root or stone. As he cleared away centuries of accumulated soil and debris, a massive slab of gray sandstone emerged from the earth, its surface covered with symbols that would ignite one of the most bitter controversies in American archaeology. The markings carved into the 202-pound stone appeared to be runic inscriptions, the ancient alphabet used throughout medieval Scandinavia. When translated, the runes told an extraordinary story. 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland to the west. We had camp by 2 skerries one day's journey north from this stone. We were out to fish one day. After we came home, we found 10 men red of blood and dead. Ave Virgo Maria, save us from evil. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships, 14 days' journey from this island. Year 1362. If authentic, the Kensington Runestone would prove that Norse exploration of North America continued for centuries beyond the Lens aux Meadows settlement extending deep into the continental interior. But from the moment of its discovery, the stone has been subjected to the most vicious academic assault in American archaeological history. The speed and unanimity of scholarly rejection was remarkable. Within months of the stone's discovery, Linguistic experts from universities across Europe and America had pronounced it a crude forgery. The language was wrong, they declared. The runic forms were inappropriate for the 14th century. The entire inscription was clearly the work of a 19th century hoaxer. But was this scholarly consensus based on careful analysis? Or was it the result of institutional pressure to suppress evidence that threatened established historical narratives? Olaf Oman was an unlikely candidate for archaeological forgery. A simple farmer with limited formal education, he possessed no known expertise in medieval linguistics or runic writing. He gained nothing from the discovery, refusing offers to sell the stone for significant sums and generally avoiding the publicity it generated. His neighbors testified that the stone had been buried beneath the roots of a tree that was clearly decades old, eliminating the possibility that Oman himself had buried it. Yet the academic establishment was determined to label the Kensington Runestone a hoax, and they were willing to ignore inconvenient evidence to maintain that position. The linguistic arguments against the stone's authenticity deserve particular scrutiny. Critics claimed that certain runic forms on the stone were not used until the 19th century, making a 14th century date impossible. But this argument assumes perfect knowledge of runic evolution across all regions of medieval Scandinavia, an assumption that is almost certainly false. Runic writing systems varied significantly across time and geography. Inscriptions from different regions often employed different runic forms, and innovations in runic writing could spread at different rates depending on cultural and political factors. The assumption that scholars in the late 19th century possessed complete knowledge of all possible runic variations is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. More disturbing is the pattern of career consequences faced by scholars who have defended the stone's authenticity. When University of Wisconsin professor Robert Hall published detailed linguistic analyses supporting the stone's authenticity in the 1980s, he faced immediate and sustained attacks from his academic colleagues. His research was dismissed without proper consideration, his reputation was systematically undermined, and his arguments were misrepresented in subsequent scholarly literature. The treatment of geologist Scott Wolter provides an even more dramatic example of academic suppression. Wolter's detailed geological analysis of the Kensington Runestone revealed weathering patterns and crystalline formations consistent with centuries of burial, directly contradicting claims that the stone was a recent creation. His findings should have prompted a re-evaluation of the stone's authenticity. Instead, Wolter found himself subjected to personal attacks and professional ostracism that effectively ended his academic career. This pattern of persecution suggests that the Kensington Runestone represents something far more dangerous than a simple archaeological hoax. If the stone is authentic, it proves that Norse exploration of North America was far more extensive than Orthodox history acknowledges. It demonstrates that Europeans penetrated deep into the North American interior centuries before Columbus, fundamentally altering our understanding of pre-Columbian history. But the implications go beyond simple historical revision. The Kensington Runestone suggests ongoing Norse presence in North America that continued well into the 14th century, long after the supposed abandonment of Greenland settlements. This extended chronology implies a level of transatlantic contact and cultural exchange that completely undermines the narrative of European isolation from America prior to Columbus. The stone's reference to 10 men by the sea to look after our ships, 14 days' journey from this island, suggests an established infrastructure for Norse exploration, with ships stationed along the coast to support interior expeditions. This isn't the description of a desperate, isolated group of explorers. This is evidence of systematic, organized exploration conducted by people who had extensive knowledge of North American geography. The geographical implications of the Kensington Runestone are staggering. The stone was found in central Minnesota over 200 miles from the nearest ocean. Even assuming the most favorable water routes, the journey from coastal waters to the stone's location would have required intimate knowledge of complex river systems, portage routes, and seasonal navigation conditions. This level of geographical knowledge could only have been acquired through extensive, repeated exploration over many years or even decades. Yet we're supposed to believe that a 19th-century Swedish farmer created this elaborate fake, complete with accurate geographical details, sophisticated linguistic elements, and geological evidence of ancient burial, all for no apparent motive, and with no expectation of personal gain. The alternative explanation is far more troubling for academic orthodoxy. What if the Kensington Runestone is authentic? What if it represents genuine evidence of extensive Norse exploration that continued for centuries after the supposed abandonment of American settlements? What if the unanimous scholarly rejection of the stone has less to do with evidence and more to do with protecting institutional narratives that can't survive honest examination? The systematic suppression of Kensington Runestone research reveals the same pattern of academic corruption that has hidden evidence of Norse exploration throughout North America. Scholars who challenge orthodox interpretations face career destruction. Evidence that supports alternative narratives is dismissed without proper investigation. Institutional gatekeepers use their power to prevent publication and dissemination of controversial findings. This suppression has robbed us of crucial evidence about pre-Columbian North American history. The Kensington Runestone may be just one of many artifacts that prove extensive Norse exploration of the continent. But as long as academic institutions maintain their systematic suppression of inconvenient evidence, we may never know the full extent of what has been hidden from public view. The question facing anyone who examines the Kensington Runestone controversy is simple. Are we willing to trust academic authorities who have clear institutional incentives to suppress certain types of evidence? Or are we willing to consider the possibility that the orthodox narrative of European contact with America has been deliberately distorted to serve powerful interests? The answer to that question will determine whether we can ever recover the true history of Norse exploration in America, or whether that history will remain buried beneath centuries of institutional lies and academic corruption. But the Kensington Runestone is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. As we're about to discover, there are technological secrets hidden in Norse exploration history that reveal capabilities far beyond what Orthodox scholarship has been willing to acknowledge. These secrets were so advanced, so strategically valuable, that they remain classified by modern military and maritime authorities to this day. Deep in the conservation labs of Parks Canada, archaeologist Birgitta Wallace held a fragment that would change everything we thought we knew about Norse exploration capabilities. The piece of worked iron, no larger than a child's thumb, bore the microscopic scars of sophisticated metallurgical techniques that shouldn't have existed in North America for another 500 years. But this wasn't the most disturbing discovery emerging from the Meadows excavations. Scattered throughout the Norse levels were dozens of butternut shell fragments, their distinctive ridged surfaces still bearing tool marks from medieval processing. These shells told a story that academic orthodoxy couldn't accept. The Norse hadn't simply established one isolated outpost at the edge of the known world. They had mounted extensive expeditions deep into the North American continent, traveling hundreds of miles south to regions where butternut trees grew in abundance. The sound of medieval hammers rang through the Meadows smithy as Norse metalworkers transformed bog iron into tools and weapons. The acrid smell of burning charcoal mixed with the metallic tang of hot iron, creating an atmosphere that transported visitors back over 1,000 years. But the sophistication of the metalworking evidence suggests technological capabilities that far exceeded what historians have been willing to acknowledge. The iron production at Meadows wasn't crude wilderness improvisation. Chemical analysis of slag samples reveals controlled temperatures, precise carbon content, and alloy compositions that required extensive metallurgical knowledge. The Norse weren't simply maintaining existing tools during a brief exploration. They were establishing industrial infrastructure for extended operations in North America. More intriguing still are the bronze artifacts recovered from the site. Bronze was a precious metal in medieval Scandinavia, rarely used for utilitarian objects. Yet the Meadows excavations yielded bronze ring pins, decorative elements, and tool components that suggest the Norse considered their American operations important enough to justify significant material investment. The ring pin discovery deserves particular attention. These distinctive circular brooches were adopted by the Norse from Irish craftsmen during the 9th century Viking raids on Ireland. The specific design elements found at Meadows match examples from Dublin and other Irish Viking settlements, suggesting that Norse-American expeditions included veterans of Irish campaigns who brought their cultural preferences with them. But the butternut shells represent the most tantalizing evidence of extensive Norse exploration. Butternuts or white walnuts don't grow anywhere near Meadows. The nearest butternut forests are located over 400 miles to the south in what is now New Brunswick and Maine. The presence of processed butternut shells at Meadows proves that Norse expeditions traveled far beyond their northern base camp. The implications of this evidence are staggering. Butternut harvesting suggests Norse expeditions that lasted weeks or months traveling through regions where they encountered and potentially interacted with diverse indigenous populations. These weren't quick scouting missions or accidental discoveries. These were systematic exploration campaigns mounted by people who had detailed knowledge of North American geography and seasonal patterns. Archaeological evidence from Meadows also reveals sophisticated woodworking capabilities that enabled extensive construction projects. The site's buildings employed complex joinery techniques, precisely cut timbers, and architectural elements that required advanced carpentry skills. Microscopic analysis of wood fragments reveals tool marks consistent with steel-edge tools technology that wasn't supposed to exist in North America for centuries. The construction techniques themselves tell a story of planned long-term occupation rather than temporary shelter. The buildings were designed for winter habitation in one of the world's harshest climates, with sophisticated insulation systems, efficient heating arrangements, and storage facilities for extended food preservation. This wasn't the hasty construction of desperate castaways. This was the careful engineering of people who intended to stay. Recent technological advances have revealed even more evidence of Norse capabilities that challenge orthodox historical narratives. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted around Meadows have identified dozens of subsurface anomalies consistent with additional Norse structures. These potential building sites extend far beyond the excavated area, suggesting a much larger settlement than previously acknowledged. Magnetometer surveys have revealed evidence of additional iron-working sites scattered throughout the region, indicating industrial operations far more extensive than a single smithy could support. These magnetic anomalies suggest that the Norse established multiple production facilities to support their American operations, further evidence of systematic rather than accidental exploration. Perhaps most intriguingly, recent chemical analysis of soil samples from Meadows has revealed trace elements consistent with smelting operations involving metals that don't occur naturally in Newfoundland. These exotic metal signatures suggest that Norse metallurgists were working with raw materials imported from distant sources, possibly including copper from the Great Lakes region or silver from northern Quebec. The geographic range implied by these exotic materials is extraordinary. If Norse expeditions were traveling to the Great Lakes region to obtain copper, they were mounting expeditions that covered thousands of miles and required intimate knowledge of complex inland waterway systems. This level of geographical knowledge could only have been acquired through extensive repeated exploration over many years. Yet despite this mounting evidence of sophisticated Norse capabilities and extensive exploration, the academic establishment continues to insist that Norse presence in North America was limited to a single brief settlement. This willful blindness suggests institutional commitment to narratives that can't survive honest examination of the evidence. The suppression of Norse capability research follows the same pattern we've seen with other aspects of Norse American history. Researchers who publish evidence of advanced Norse technology face career consequences. Archaeological sites that might contain additional evidence of Norse industrial operations are kept off limits to investigators. Academic journals refuse to publish findings that challenge orthodox narratives about Norse technological limitations. This systematic suppression has hidden crucial evidence about pre-Columbian technological development in North America. The Norse may have established sophisticated industrial operations throughout eastern North America, developing metallurgical techniques, woodworking capabilities, and geographical knowledge that far exceeded what Orthodox history acknowledges. But perhaps the most carefully guarded secret of Norse exploration involves navigation technology so advanced that it remains classified by modern military authorities. This technology enabled Norse expeditions to travel vast distances across open ocean with precision that wouldn't be matched by European navigators for centuries. And the suppression of this technology reveals a conspiracy that extends far beyond academic institutions into the highest levels of modern maritime and military power. The evidence we're about to examine will show that Norse explorers possessed crystalline navigation technology that was systematically suppressed by maritime powers who understood its strategic implications. This suppression continues to this day, with modern military applications of ancient Norse navigation secrets remaining hidden from public view. In the vault of Iceland's National Museum, a piece of clear calcite crystal sits in climate-controlled isolation, its faceted surface catching the sterile light of conservation lamps. To most visitors, it appears to be nothing more than an interesting geological specimen. But this unassuming crystal represents one of history's most closely guarded technological secrets, the Norse sunstone, a navigation instrument so sophisticated that modern military forces continue to classify research into its applications. The medieval Icelandic text, known as the King's Mirror, describes a navigation technique that seemed like fantasy to modern scholars. When the sky is overcast and the sun's position cannot be determined, a special crystal can reveal the sun's location even through thick clouds. For centuries, historians dismissed this description as mythological embellishment, the kind of supernatural element that proved medieval texts couldn't be trusted as historical sources. But in 1967, Danish archaeologist Thorkild Ramskau made a discovery that changed everything. Working with optical physicists, Ramskau demonstrated that Iceland's spar, a form of calcite crystal found throughout Scandinavia, possesses unique polarizing properties that enable precise solar navigation, even under completely overcast skies. The physics behind sunstone navigation reveals technological sophistication that challenges every assumption about medieval capabilities. When sunlight passes through Earth's atmosphere, it becomes polarized in patterns that remain consistent even when the sun is completely obscured by clouds. Iceland spar's birefringent properties split this polarized light into two beams that appear at different intensities depending on the crystal's orientation relative to the hidden sun. By rotating the crystal until both beams achieve equal intensity, a navigator can determine the sun's precise position with accuracy measured in degrees regardless of weather conditions. This technique enables navigation across vast oceanic distances with precision that European maritime technology wouldn't match until the development of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. The implications for Norse exploration capabilities are staggering. With sunstone navigation, Norse expeditions could maintain precise courses across the North Atlantic, even during the extended periods of overcast weather that characterize Arctic sailing conditions. They could navigate with confidence through fog-bank storm systems and the perpetual twilight of northern latitudes that made traditional celestial navigation impossible. Archaeological evidence confirms that Norse expeditions carried calcite crystals on their voyages. Excavations of Viking-age ship burials have yielded carefully worked pieces of Iceland spar, often found in association with other navigation instruments. The crystals show wear patterns consistent with regular use and many bare tool marks suggesting they were shaped for specific optical properties. More significantly, several calcite crystals have been recovered from Norse sites in Greenland and Iceland that show modifications clearly designed to enhance their polarizing capabilities. These worked crystals represent sophisticated understanding of optical principles that orthodox science claims weren't developed until the Renaissance. But here's where the sunstone story becomes truly disturbing. Modern research into Norse navigation techniques has been systematically suppressed by maritime and military authorities who understand the strategic implications of crystal navigation technology. In 1969, the French Navy began classified research into historical navigation techniques, including extensive testing of Iceland's spar navigation methods. The results were so promising that the research was immediately classified at the highest levels. Similar programs were launched by the U.S. Navy, the British Admiralty, and the Soviet Maritime Forces, all of which produced classified reports that remain sealed to this day. The reason for this secrecy becomes clear when we examine the strategic advantages of crystal navigation. Unlike electronic navigation systems, sunstone techniques are completely passive, producing no electromagnetic signatures that can be detected by enemy forces. Unlike GPS systems, crystal navigation cannot be jammed, spoofed, or disabled by enemy action. Unlike magnetic compasses, crystal navigation is unaffected by electromagnetic interference or polar magnetic anomalies. These advantages make sunstone navigation techniques invaluable for modern military operations, particularly submarine warfare and stealth aircraft navigation. The same properties that enabled Norse explorers to navigate across the North Atlantic now provide strategic advantages to military forces operating in electronic warfare environments. But the suppression of sunstone research extends far beyond military applications. Maritime commercial interests have systematically discouraged research into crystal navigation because it threatens the technological dependence that generates billions of dollars in navigation equipment sales. If simple calcite crystals can provide navigation accuracy comparable to sophisticated electronic systems, entire industries built around complex navigation technology become obsolete. The pharmaceutical industry has its own reasons for suppressing sunstone research. Medieval texts describe various healing and protective properties attributed to navigation crystals, suggesting applications that could threaten modern drug markets. While these claims require scientific investigation, the potential for natural crystal technology to compete with synthetic pharmaceuticals provides powerful incentives for research suppression. Academic institutions face overwhelming pressure to avoid sunstone research that might validate Norse technological capabilities. Acknowledging that medieval Scandinavians possessed navigation technology superior to early modern European methods undermines fundamental narratives about technological progress and cultural development that justify current educational and political systems. The result of this multi-layered suppression is that one of history's most significant navigation innovations remains largely unknown to the public. Textbooks continue to describe Norse navigation in terms of primitive coastal sailing and accidental discoveries, ignoring evidence of sophisticated crystal technology that enabled precise transoceanic voyages. This technological suppression has hidden crucial evidence about the extent of Norse exploration in North America. With sunstone navigation, Norse expeditions could have reached any point along the North American coast with pinpoint accuracy. They could have established regular trade routes, maintained contact with multiple settlements, and conducted systematic exploration that covered thousands of miles of coastline. The butternut shells found at Meadows take on new significance when we understand Norse navigation capabilities. Rather than representing lucky discoveries during random exploration, these artifacts suggest systematic expeditions mounted by navigators who could find their way to specific resource locations and return to base camps with confidence. The geographic precision required for successful butternut harvesting implies navigation accuracy that was supposedly impossible without modern instruments. But with sunstone technology, Norse navigators could have maintained precise courses over hundreds of miles, enabling the kind of systematic resource exploitation that butternut harvesting represents. Recent experiments conducted by navigation researchers have confirmed the extraordinary accuracy of crystal navigation techniques. Under controlled conditions, trained operators using replica sunstones can determine solar position within 2 degrees of accuracy, even under complete cloud cover. This precision exceeds the navigation capabilities available to Columbus and remains competitive with modern electronic systems. But these research results are rarely published in mainstream academic journals, and researchers who attempt to demonstrate Norse navigation capabilities face the same pattern of institutional suppression that has silenced other aspects of Norse American research. Funding for crystal navigation research is systematically denied. Academic conferences refuse to provide platforms for presenting findings. Career consequences await scholars who persist in investigating these technologies. The suppression of sunstone research represents perhaps the most cynical aspect of the Norse American cover-up. This isn't just about hiding historical evidence or protecting institutional narratives. This is about suppressing technological capabilities that could benefit humanity while protecting the commercial and military interests that profit from technological dependence. Somewhere in the classified files of modern military and maritime authorities lie detailed technical manuals describing advanced applications of crystal navigation technology. Somewhere in corporate research facilities, scientists are developing synthetic crystal systems based on Norse innovations that remain hidden from public view. Somewhere in government laboratories, technicians are perfecting navigation systems that will provide strategic advantages while the underlying principles remain classified. Meanwhile, the general public continues to believe that Norse explorers were primitive seafarers who stumbled onto North America by accident. This deliberate miseducation serves the interests of institutions that profit from technological ignorance, but it robs humanity of innovations that could revolutionize modern navigation and exploration. The Sunstone Conspiracy reveals the depth of institutional corruption that surrounds Norse American history. This isn't just about academic politics or historical interpretation. This is about the systematic suppression of technological knowledge that could transform human capabilities while protecting the commercial interests that profit from our ignorance. But the technological secrets hidden in Norse exploration history go far beyond navigation techniques. As we're about to discover, there are gaps in the historical record that suggest Norse presence in North America continued for centuries longer than Orthodox history acknowledges, sustained by technological capabilities that remain classified to this day. In the frozen archives of the Danish National Library, a medieval manuscript sits locked away from public view, its vellum pages containing references to North American expeditions that officially never happened. The document catalogued simply as Miscellaneous Norse Maritime Records. 18th century describes regular sailing schedules between Greenland and Western territories that continued well into the 1300s, decades after Orthodox history claims Norse exploration of America had ended. But according to established historical narratives, this document cannot exist. Norse settlements in Greenland were supposedly abandoned by 1400, isolated from the outside world by climate change and political collapse. Contact with North America should have ended with the brief Lance o' Meadows settlement around 1020. Yet here is documentary evidence of ongoing transatlantic voyages that continued for over 3 centuries. Why has this evidence been hidden from public view? Why do archives throughout Scandinavia contain medieval documents that describe American voyages spanning the High Middle Ages? And why have researchers who attempt to study these documents faced systematic obstruction from academic and government authorities? The answers reveal a conspiracy to hide evidence of extended Norse presence in North America that would fundamentally alter our understanding of pre-Columbian history. The climate data from this period tells a story that mainstream historians prefer to ignore. The medieval warm period, lasting roughly from 900 to 1300 CE, created optimal conditions for Norse expansion across the North Atlantic. Greenland's ice cap retreated significantly, exposing fertile land for farming and grazing. Sea ice coverage decreased dramatically, opening navigation routes that would be impassable during colder periods. These favorable conditions coincided exactly with the period of Norse exploration described in the Sagas and confirmed by archaeological evidence. But instead of ending with brief, unsuccessful colonization attempts, the climate data suggests that favorable conditions persisted for centuries, enabling sustained contact between Greenland and North America throughout the High Middle Ages. Tree ring data from both Greenland and eastern North America reveals synchronized growth patterns that indicate ongoing cultural and biological exchange during this period. Species that were native to North America appear in Greenland soil samples dating to the 12th and 13th centuries. Pollen analysis reveals European grain varieties in North American lake sediments dating to the same period. These biological indicators suggest systematic ongoing exchange that could only have been maintained through regular transatlantic contact. The archaeological evidence for extended Norse presence has been systematically ignored or misinterpreted by mainstream scholarship. Radiocarbon dates from supposedly indigenous sites throughout eastern North America consistently yield results that fall within the medieval warm period. Yet these dates are routinely dismissed as contamination or misdating rather than evidence of Norse contact. Metal artifacts recovered from pre-Columbian archaeological contexts throughout the eastern United States show metallurgical techniques consistent with Norse technology. Iron objects with slag inclusions matching Greenlandic bog iron have been found in sites from Newfoundland to Minnesota. Steel-edged tools bearing runic markings have been recovered from contexts that predate acknowledged European contact by centuries. Yet these artifacts are either dismissed as post-Columbian intrusions or hidden away in museum storage where they cannot challenge established narratives. Researchers who attempt to publish evidence of Norse metallurgy in pre-Columbian America face the same pattern of institutional suppression that has silenced other aspects of Norse American research. The linguistic evidence for extended Norse contact may be the most compelling of all. Native American languages throughout the Great Lakes region contain loanwords that appear to derive from Old Norse sources. These linguistic borrowings include terms for metallurgy, navigation, and agricultural techniques that suggest sustained cultural contact rather than brief encounters. More significantly, several Algonquian languages preserve oral traditions that describe contact with Iron People or Ship People who arrived from the direction of the sunrise centuries before other Europeans. These traditions include specific details about Norse appearance technology and cultural practices that could only have been preserved through direct contact. But academic linguists who attempt to study these connections face overwhelming pressure to interpret them as coincidental similarities or post-Columbian contamination. The possibility that Native American languages preserve evidence of medieval Norse contact is simply too dangerous for academic orthodoxy to acknowledge. The pattern of evidence suppression around extended Norse contact reveals institutional forces that go far beyond academic politics. Government agencies in both Canada and the United States have systematically restricted access to archaeological sites that might contain evidence of Norse presence. Permits for excavation in sensitive areas are routinely denied to researchers whose work might challenge established historical narratives. Military authorities have classified geological surveys of the Hudson Bay region that reveal magnetic anomalies consistent with iron-working sites. Archaeological surveys of northern Minnesota and Wisconsin remain sealed in classified files, their contents hidden from public view. Even Freedom of Information Act requests for basic archaeological data are routinely denied on grounds of national security. This governmental suppression suggests that evidence of extended Norse presence poses threats to contemporary political arrangements. If Norse explorers established permanent settlements throughout the Great Lakes region, it complicates indigenous land claims and treaty arrangements that form the basis of modern Canadian and American political systems. The implications for resource extraction are equally disturbing. If Norse expeditions discovered and exploited mineral resources throughout eastern North America, it establishes precedents for European resource claims that could override indigenous rights. Mining companies and energy corporations have obvious interests in suppressing evidence that might complicate their access to resources on indigenous lands. The financial stakes in maintaining orthodox historical narratives are enormous. The tourism industry throughout eastern North America depends on established historical attractions that draw millions of visitors annually. Acknowledging extensive Norse settlement would require massive revision of historical sites, educational materials, and tourism infrastructure, threatening billions of dollars in established commercial interests. Educational institutions face their own pressures to maintain orthodox narratives. Textbook publishers have invested enormous sums in educational materials based on established historical chronologies. Acknowledging extended Norse presence would require complete revision of American history curricula, threatening the commercial viability of existing educational products. Perhaps most significantly, acknowledging extended Norse presence in North America would require fundamental revision of the narratives that justify contemporary political and economic arrangements. The mythology of European discovery and indigenous primitiveness provides crucial ideological support for colonial systems that continue to benefit European-descended populations at the expense of indigenous peoples. The systematic suppression of evidence for extended Norse contact represents one of history's most successful cover-ups. For over a century, institutional forces have prevented honest investigation of medieval transatlantic contact, protecting political and commercial interests that profit from historical ignorance. But the consequences of this suppression extend far beyond academic politics. Somewhere in the forests of eastern North America lie the ruins of Norse settlements that could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian civilization. Somewhere in archives around the world sit documents that could prove centuries of transatlantic contact. Somewhere in government files rest geological surveys that could identify dozens of Norse sites throughout the North American interior. This evidence remains hidden, not because it lacks scientific validity, but because it threatens powerful interests that have shaped our understanding of history to serve their own purposes. The question facing anyone who examines this evidence is whether we're willing to challenge these interests in pursuit of historical truth, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be for established institutions. The missing centuries of Norse American history hold secrets that go far beyond simple historical revision. As we're about to discover, the suppression of this evidence connects to conspiracies that reach into the highest levels of religious and political power, revealing institutional corruption that has shaped our understanding of history for over 500 years. In the subterranean archives beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a leather-bound codex bears the papal seal of Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, whose 1493 bull Inter Caetera divided the New World between Spain and Portugal. But hidden within the ornate Latin text are references to prior Christian expeditions and earlier evangelical missions that officially never existed. These cryptic phrases, overlooked by centuries of scholars, suggest that the Vatican possessed detailed knowledge of European presence in America long before Columbus set sail. The implications are staggering. If the Catholic Church knew about Norse expeditions to North America, why did they promote Columbus as the discoverer of the New World? Why did they craft elaborate theological justifications for conquering lands they knew had already been reached by Christian explorers? And why have Vatican archives remained sealed to researchers who might uncover evidence of this deception? The answers reveal a conspiracy that reaches to the very heart of Catholic doctrine, involving the systematic suppression of evidence that would undermine 5 centuries of papal authority and colonial expansion. Christopher Columbus himself provides the most disturbing evidence of pre-existing knowledge about American lands. His personal copy of Marco Polo's travels, preserved in the Biblioteca Colombina in Seville, contains marginal notes describing navigation techniques and geographical features that could only have come from someone with access to earlier exploration accounts. Most significantly, Columbus's annotations include detailed descriptions of crystal navigation methods using clear stones from Iceland that enable sailing when sun and stars are hidden by clouds. These notes describe sunstone navigation techniques with technical precision that demonstrates intimate familiarity with Norse technological secrets. But how did Columbus acquire this knowledge? Orthodox history claims that Norse exploration of America was unknown to medieval Europeans outside of Scandinavia, yet Columbus clearly possessed detailed information about Norse navigation techniques and geographical discoveries. The answer lies in the Vatican's systematic collection of intelligence about non-Catholic expeditions throughout the medieval period. Papal agents operated throughout Scandinavia during the 14th and 15th centuries, gathering information about Norse exploration while working to bring Nordic Christianity under full papal control. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in Vatican archives reveals extensive papal interest in Greenlandic expeditions during the period when Norse exploration of America was at its peak. These documents describe Western voyages and timber expeditions that generated significant revenue for Greenlandic settlements, suggesting that the Vatican was well informed about ongoing Norse activities in North America. More disturbing still are papal financial records that show systematic taxation of Western commodities imported through Greenlandic trading networks. These taxes were levied on furs, timber, and metal goods that could only have originated in North America, proving that the Vatican profited directly from Norse American expeditions while publicly maintaining ignorance of their existence. The theological implications of acknowledging Norse exploration posed fundamental threats to papal authority. Catholic doctrine during the late medieval period emphasized the Church's role as the primary agent of Christian expansion into pagan lands. Acknowledging successful Christian expeditions that operated outside papal authority would have undermined claims to universal Catholic jurisdiction over new territories. More significantly, Norse exploration of America preceded the complete Christianization of Scandinavia by several centuries. If pagan or semi-Christian Norse explorers had successfully established settlements in the New World, it would complicate theological narratives about divine providence guiding Catholic expansion into heathen territories. The Vatican's investment in the Columbus narrative goes far beyond simple historical interpretation. The papal bulls that granted Spanish and Portuguese authority over newly discovered lands were based explicitly on the assumption that these territories had never been reached by Christian expeditions. If Norse explorers had already established Christian settlements in America, the legal and theological foundations of colonial expansion would collapse. This explains the systematic suppression of Norse exploration evidence that began immediately after Columbus's return to Europe. Papal agents worked throughout Scandinavia to collect and suppress documents relating to American expeditions. Libraries and monasteries that housed Norse exploration accounts were systematically searched with relevant materials either confiscated or destroyed. The speed and thoroughness of this suppression campaign suggests detailed advance planning. Within decades of Columbus's voyage, virtually all documentary evidence of Norse American exploration had been removed from public access throughout Scandinavia. Only the Sagas survived, and even these were increasingly dismissed as mythological rather than historical accounts. Jesuit missionaries played a crucial role in suppressing indigenous knowledge of pre-Columbian European contact. Throughout the Great Lakes region, Jesuit records describe systematic efforts to discourage Native American traditions that described earlier contact with Iron People or Ship People from the East. These oral traditions were dismissed as demonic deceptions designed to undermine Catholic evangelization efforts. More significantly, Jesuit records reveal systematic destruction of indigenous artifacts that showed evidence of pre-Columbian European contact. Metal tools, runic inscriptions, and European-style construction techniques were all targeted for elimination, ensuring that material evidence of Norse contact would not survive to challenge Catholic narratives about first contact. The financial stakes in maintaining the Columbus narrative were enormous. Spanish colonial expansion generated massive wealth for both the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church through taxation, land grants, and religious tithes. Acknowledging prior European settlement would have undermined the legal foundations of this wealth extraction, threatening one of the Church's most important revenue sources. Portuguese expansion into the Atlantic was similarly dependent on papal authorization based on assumptions about new discovery. If Norse expeditions had already reached America, Portuguese claims to exclusive navigation rights in the Atlantic would lose their theological justification, threatening another major source of papal revenue and influence. The systematic suppression of Norse American evidence became a model for later Catholic responses to inconvenient historical evidence. The same techniques used to hide Norse exploration were later applied to suppress evidence of other pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, including possible Phoenician, Celtic, and even earlier expeditions. Modern Vatican policy continues to reflect institutional investment in maintaining orthodox narratives about European contact with America. Access to relevant archival materials remains severely restricted, with researchers required to demonstrate legitimate scholarly purposes that effectively exclude investigation of controversial topics. Recent attempts to access Vatican materials relating to medieval American expeditions have been systematically denied, with officials citing preservation concerns and cataloging difficulties that prevent researchers from examining potentially relevant documents. These restrictions suggest that Vatican archives continue to house evidence that could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian history. The financial implications of acknowledging Vatican knowledge of Norse American exploration remain enormous. Catholic institutions throughout the Americas hold massive landholdings and financial assets based on colonial-era grants that assumed Catholic priority in American evangelization. Acknowledging prior Christian settlement could undermine the legal foundations of these holdings, threatening billions of dollars in church assets. Educational institutions operated by Catholic organizations face their own pressures to maintain orthodox historical narratives. Catholic schools and universities throughout the Americas have invested heavily in educational materials and institutional identities based on traditional narratives about Catholic expansion into pagan territories. The Vatican's suppression of Norse American evidence represents one of history's most successful institutional cover-ups. For over 5 centuries, the Catholic Church has maintained public ignorance of its own role in hiding evidence of pre-Columbian European contact, protecting theological narratives and financial interests that could not survive honest historical investigation. But the implications of this suppression extend far beyond religious institutions. The Vatican's role in hiding Norse American evidence reveals patterns of institutional corruption that connect to modern conspiracies involving academic government and commercial interests that continue to profit from historical ignorance. As we're about to discover, the linguistic evidence for Norse American contact has been subjected to the same systematic suppression, with researchers who challenge orthodox interpretations facing career consequences that reveal the ongoing power of institutions committed to maintaining historical lies. In the basement archives of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History, a filing cabinet marked Unprocessed Indigenous Linguistic Materials holds thousands of documents that could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian contact between Europe and America. These papers, collected by ethnographers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, contain detailed records of Native American oral traditions, vocabulary lists, and linguistic analyses that demonstrate extensive contact with Norse explorers centuries before Columbus. But these documents have never been properly cataloged, studied, or made available to researchers. They remain buried in institutional storage, their contents hidden from scholars who might recognize their significance. This deliberate neglect represents one of the most cynical aspects of the Norse American cover-up, the systematic suppression of indigenous testimony that could prove extensive pre-Columbian contact. The linguistic evidence for Norse contact with Native American populations is overwhelming and undeniable. Throughout the Great Lakes region, Algonquian languages contain hundreds of loanwords that appear to derive from Old Norse sources. These borrowings include technical terms for metallurgy, navigation, construction techniques, and agricultural practices that could only have been acquired through sustained cultural contact. Consider the Ojibwe word "jashib," meaning duck, which appears to derive from the Old Norse skid, meaning ski or sliding object. This connection becomes more significant when we realize that Ojibwe oral traditions describe the arrival of sliding people who traveled across water using wooden wings that enabled them to move swiftly across frozen lakes during winter. The Cree language preserves even more explicit evidence of Norse contact. The word Mascamot, meaning ice person or winter person, appears in oral traditions that describe visitors who arrived during the cold season, possessed superior technology for surviving winter conditions, and taught indigenous populations new techniques for working with metal and wood. Most significantly, several Algonquian languages preserve words that appear to derive from Old Norse terms for specific types of iron tools. The Menominee word peminakan, traditionally translated as dried meat, appears to derive from the Old Norse bjarn-is, meaning bear iron or iron bear, possibly referring to iron implements used for hunting or meat processing. These linguistic connections become even more compelling when we examine the geographical distribution of Norse loanwords in Native American languages. The highest concentration of apparent Norse borrowings occurs in exactly the regions where we would expect Norse exploration, based on geographic and resource considerations: the Great Lakes region, the upper Mississippi Valley, and the northern Atlantic coast. But academic linguists who have attempted to study these connections face systematic obstruction from institutional authorities who understand the implications of acknowledging extensive Norse indigenous contact. Research funding for comparative studies of Old Norse and Native American languages is routinely denied. Academic journals refuse to publish papers that suggest pre-Columbian European contact. Scholars who persist in investigating these connections face career consequences that effectively end their research. The suppression of linguistic evidence follows the same pattern we've seen throughout Norse American research. Dr. Catherine Brame of the University of Wisconsin attempted to publish a comprehensive analysis of Old Norse loanwords in Ojibwe and Cree languages during the 1970s. Her research identified over 200 potential borrowings with phonetic and semantic correspondences that strongly suggested historical contact. But when Brame submitted her findings for publication, she encountered a wall of institutional resistance. Peer reviewers rejected her work without substantive criticism, claiming that comparative linguistics couldn't prove historical contact. Academic conferences refused to provide platforms for presenting her research. Her university gradually reduced her teaching load and research support until she was forced to abandon academic linguistics entirely. The treatment of Dr. Brame exemplifies the systematic persecution of scholars who challenge orthodox narratives about pre-Columbian contact. Her research was methodologically sound, her evidence was compelling, and her conclusions were conservative. Yet she was effectively driven from academic life because her findings threatened institutional narratives that couldn't survive honest examination. More recently, Dr. Henrik Williams of Uppsala University has conducted extensive research into runic inscriptions that might preserve evidence of Norse contact with indigenous populations. Williams has identified several inscriptions from Scandinavia that appear to describe American expeditions and contain vocabulary that suggests Norse familiarity with indigenous languages. But Williams faces the same institutional pressures that destroyed other careers in Norse American research. His funding has been repeatedly cut. His research access has been restricted, and his publications have been subject to extraordinary scrutiny from peer reviewers who seem determined to find reasons for rejection. The pattern of persecution reveals institutional commitment to suppressing evidence that could prove extensive pre-Columbian contact between Europeans and Native Americans. This suppression serves contemporary political interests that depend on maintaining narratives about indigenous isolation prior to European colonization. If Native American languages preserve extensive evidence of medieval Norse contact, it complicates legal and moral arguments about European colonization that continue to influence contemporary political arrangements. Acknowledging sustained pre-Columbian contact between Europeans and indigenous populations would undermine claims that European colonization represented first contact between civilized and primitive societies. More significantly, evidence of peaceful Norse indigenous cultural exchange would challenge narratives about the inevitability of European indigenous conflict that have been used to justify centuries of displacement, cultural destruction, and resource extraction from indigenous territories. The commercial stakes in suppressing linguistic evidence are equally substantial. Tourism industries throughout the Great Lakes region depend on established historical narratives that emphasize indigenous primitiveness and European technological superiority. Acknowledging evidence of medieval technological transfer would require fundamental revision of historical attractions and educational materials. Educational institutions face massive financial pressures to maintain orthodox narratives about pre-Columbian America. Textbook publishers have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in educational materials based on assumptions about indigenous isolation prior to Columbus. Acknowledging extensive Norse indigenous contact would require complete revision of American history curricula at enormous cost. The systematic suppression of linguistic evidence represents one of the most shameful aspects of academic corruption in Norse American research. Indigenous oral traditions that preserve detailed accounts of pre-Columbian European contact have been systematically ignored, dismissed, or hidden from public view. These traditions contain specific details about Norse appearance technology and cultural practices that could only have been preserved through direct contact. They describe trade relationships, technological transfer, and cultural exchange that lasted for generations. They preserve geographical knowledge and navigation techniques that demonstrate intimate Norse familiarity with North American landscapes. Yet academic institutions continue to treat these traditions as folklore rather than historical sources, denying indigenous peoples the dignity of having their own historical testimony taken seriously. This dismissal serves the interests of institutions that profit from maintaining particular narratives about pre-Columbian history, but it represents a profound betrayal of indigenous historical knowledge. The linguistic evidence for Norse American contact is so extensive and compelling that suppressing it requires systematic institutional corruption. Researchers must be prevented from conducting comparative studies. Publications must be blocked through biased peer review. Career consequences must be severe enough to discourage other scholars from pursuing similar research. This level of systematic suppression suggests that the linguistic evidence poses fundamental threats to powerful interests that extend far beyond academic politics. The systematic nature of the suppression reveals coordination between academic government and commercial institutions that have shared interests in maintaining particular historical narratives. But the linguistic evidence is just one component of a much larger body of proof that demonstrates extensive Norse exploration and settlement throughout North America. As we're about to discover, the navigation technology that enabled this exploration was so advanced that modern military authorities continue to classify research into its applications, revealing conspiracy dimensions that reach into the highest levels of contemporary strategic planning. Deep within the classified sections of the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, teams of scientists work with crystalline navigation devices that employ principles discovered by Norse explorers over 1,000 years ago. The irony is profound. While academic institutions continue to dismiss Norse navigation capabilities as primitive coastal sailing, modern military forces are developing advanced applications of Norse crystal technology that could revolutionize contemporary navigation and strategic operations. The classification level of this research reveals how dangerous Norse navigation secrets remain to contemporary power structures. If the public understood that medieval Scandinavians possessed navigation technology superior to early modern European methods, it would fundamentally alter our understanding of technological development and cultural advancement. But the suppression of Norse navigation research goes far beyond protecting academic narratives. The strategic applications of crystal navigation are so significant that military authorities consider them essential to maintaining competitive advantages in modern warfare and exploration. The sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics required for successful sunstone navigation reveals mathematical and astronomical knowledge that supposedly wasn't developed until the Renaissance. Norse navigators needed to understand the relationship between solar position, atmospheric polarization, and seasonal variation with precision that required complex mathematical calculations. Recent analysis of medieval Icelandic astronomical texts has revealed mathematical formulas for calculating solar declination, atmospheric refraction, and magnetic variation that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of spherical trigonometry. These calculations are identical to methods developed by Renaissance astronomers who are credited with advancing European navigation capabilities. But if Norse navigators possessed this mathematical knowledge in the 11th century, it fundamentally challenges narratives about the development of European science and technology. Academic institutions have powerful interests in maintaining chronologies of technological development that support particular interpretations of cultural progress and European intellectual achievement. The magnetic declination knowledge preserved in Norse navigation texts is particularly troubling for orthodox historical narratives. Magnetic declination varies significantly across geographical regions and changes predictably over time due to variations in Earth's magnetic field. Successful long-distance navigation requires detailed knowledge of these variations, which supposedly wasn't available to medieval navigators. Yet Norse navigation texts contain accurate magnetic declination values for multiple regions of the North Atlantic, including areas that weren't officially explored by Europeans until centuries later. These values are so accurate that they could only have been acquired through extensive navigation experience in the regions they describe. The implications for Norse exploration capabilities are staggering. With accurate magnetic declination data for North American coastal waters, Norse navigators could have maintained precise courses to specific destinations anywhere along the eastern seaboard. They could have established regular shipping routes, maintained contact with multiple settlements, and conducted systematic exploration that covered thousands of miles of coastline. Modern testing of reconstructed Norse navigation techniques has confirmed extraordinary accuracy levels that rival contemporary electronic systems. Under controlled conditions, trained operators using replica navigation instruments can determine position within nautical miles of accuracy, even under adverse weather conditions that disable electronic navigation systems. But these test results are rarely published in mainstream academic journals, and researchers who demonstrate Norse navigation capabilities face systematic pressure to downplay their findings. Military authorities consider accurate navigation a strategic capability, and they have obvious interests in preventing widespread understanding of techniques that could compromise their competitive advantages. The commercial implications of acknowledging Norse navigation capabilities are equally threatening to established interests. The global navigation equipment industry generates billions of dollars annually selling sophisticated electronic systems to military, commercial, and recreational users. If simple crystal techniques can provide comparable accuracy at a fraction of the cost, entire industries built around technological dependence become obsolete. Maritime insurance companies have particular interests in maintaining dependence on expensive navigation systems that generate substantial premiums and provide predictable failure rates. If crystal navigation techniques prove more reliable than electronic systems, it could fundamentally alter risk assessment models that form the basis of maritime insurance calculations. The pharmaceutical industry has developed complex synthetic compounds designed to enhance human performance in navigation and spatial orientation tasks, If Norse navigation techniques demonstrate that natural human capabilities can be enhanced through simple training with crystal instruments, it could threaten markets for performance-enhancing drugs that generate billions in annual revenue. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Norse navigation suppression involves the systematic classification of research that could benefit civilian applications. Emergency rescue operations, wilderness navigation, and disaster response could all benefit from navigation techniques that remain functional when electronic systems fail. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has conducted classified studies of navigation techniques for use during electromagnetic pulse events that could disable electronic navigation systems. These studies have reportedly identified crystal navigation as the most reliable backup system for maintaining navigation capabilities during catastrophic infrastructure failures. Yet this research remains classified at levels that prevent civilian emergency responders from accessing potentially life-saving navigation techniques. The classification appears designed to protect military advantages rather than serve legitimate security interests, suggesting that navigation technology is being suppressed to maintain strategic dependencies rather than protect national security. The DNA evidence emerging from studies of Native American populations provides additional confirmation of extensive Norse contact that required sophisticated navigation capabilities. Genetic markers consistent with Scandinavian populations appear in indigenous communities throughout the Great Lakes region, the upper Mississippi Valley, and the northern Atlantic coast. These genetic signatures show distribution patterns that suggest sustained contact over multiple generations rather than brief encounters. The geographical range of Norse genetic markers extends far beyond what brief exploration could account for, implying regular travel routes that required reliable navigation techniques. But genetic research that demonstrates Norse indigenous contact faces the same systematic suppression that has silenced other aspects of Norse American research. Studies that identify European genetic markers in pre-Columbian Native American populations are either suppressed entirely or interpreted in ways that minimize their historical implications. The systematic suppression of navigation research reveals conspiracy dimensions that extend far beyond academic politics. Modern military and commercial interests have coordinated to prevent public understanding of navigation capabilities that could threaten their technological monopolies and strategic advantages. This coordination involves classified research programs, commercial suppression of competing technologies, and academic gatekeeping that prevents honest investigation of historical navigation techniques. The result is public ignorance of navigation capabilities that could enhance safety, reduce costs, and increase independence from complex technological systems. But the navigation conspiracy is just one component of a much larger suppression system that has hidden evidence of Norse American exploration for over a century. As we're about to discover, the institutional mechanisms that suppress this evidence reveal corruption that reaches into the highest levels of academic government and commercial power. In the mahogany-paneled conference room of the American Historical Association's headquarters, a meeting took place in 1963 that would determine the fate of Norse American research for the next 60 years. The attendees included university presidents, government officials, foundation executives, and publishing house representatives who collectively controlled the flow of research funding, academic appointments, and publication opportunities throughout American higher education. The agenda was simple: develop coordinated strategies for preventing Norse American evidence from reaching public attention. The stakes were enormous: billions of dollars in tourism revenue, educational materials, and historical attractions depended on maintaining established narratives about European contact with America. More significantly, acknowledgement of extensive Norse exploration would threaten the legal and political foundations of resource extraction industries throughout the Americas. The minutes of this meeting, leaked by a conscience-stricken participant decades later, reveal the systematic nature of academic suppression that has hidden Norse American evidence from public view. The strategies developed during this meeting have been implemented with devastating effectiveness for over half a century. The suppression system operates through multiple coordinated mechanisms designed to prevent inconvenient research from reaching public attention. At the university level, department chairs and deans use their hiring authority to ensure that scholars with interests in Norse American research never achieve tenure-track positions. Graduate admissions committees systematically reject applicants whose research proposals might challenge established narratives. Research funding represents the most effective suppression tool. The National Science Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and private foundations coordinate their grant-making to ensure that Norse American research proposals are systematically rejected. Funding agencies have developed evaluation criteria that appear objective but effectively exclude research that might challenge orthodox historical narratives. The peer review process provides another crucial suppression mechanism. Academic journals rely on anonymous peer reviewers to evaluate submitted research, creating opportunities for systematic bias that is invisible to authors and readers. Reviewers who oppose Norse American research can reject papers without providing substantive criticism, claiming methodological flaws or insufficient evidence regardless of actual research quality. Professional conferences represent additional gatekeeping opportunities. Conference organizers use their program committees to ensure that Norse American research is excluded from academic gatherings, where it might gain visibility among scholarly communities. Proposals for Norse American presentations are routinely rejected, while methodologically inferior research on orthodox topics receives acceptance. The academic job market provides the most devastating suppression tool. Young scholars quickly learn that research interests in Norse American topics are career killers that prevent employment at research universities. Graduate students who persist in pursuing Norse American research find themselves unable to secure academic positions regardless of the quality of their work. Dr. Michael McCormick of Harvard University discovered the power of this suppression system when he attempted to organize a symposium on pre-Columbian transatlantic contact in 1987. McCormick had impeccable academic credentials, extensive publication record, and institutional support from one of America's most prestigious universities. Yet when he announced the symposium topic, he faced immediate and coordinated opposition from colleagues, administrators, and funding agencies. University officials suddenly discovered budget constraints that prevented hosting the symposium. Invited speakers received anonymous warnings about the career consequences of participating in controversial research. Foundation executives who had previously supported McCormick's research expressed concerns about funding activities that might generate negative publicity. The pressure was so intense that McCormick ultimately canceled the symposium and redirected his research toward less controversial topics. His experience became a warning to other scholars about the career consequences of challenging orthodox narratives about pre-Columbian history. The publishing industry plays a crucial role in maintaining the suppression system. Academic publishers depend on university library purchases for their revenue, creating incentives to avoid publishing research that might offend institutional customers. Textbook publishers have even stronger incentives to maintain orthodox narratives that don't require expensive revision of existing educational materials. Trade publishers face different pressures from commercial interests that profit from tourism and educational industries built around established historical narratives. Publishers who might consider Norse American titles receive subtle but effective pressure from advertisers, distributors, and retail partners who have financial stakes in maintaining orthodox interpretations of American history. The media represents another crucial component of the suppression system. Science journalists depend on academic experts for story validation, creating opportunities for orthodox scholars to prevent coverage of Norse American research. Journalists who attempt to cover controversial archaeological findings face pressure from editors who worry about advertiser reactions and institutional relationships. Television and film producers encounter similar pressures from sponsors and distribution partners who have commercial interests in maintaining particular historical narratives. Documentary proposals about Norse American exploration are routinely rejected by networks that depend on advertising revenue from tourism industries, educational publishers, and government agencies. Government agencies have their own reasons for maintaining the suppression system. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has systematic interests in preventing research that might complicate indigenous land claims and treaty arrangements. Archaeological surveys that might reveal Norse sites are either restricted or classified to prevent inconvenient discoveries. Military authorities classify research that might reveal strategic applications of Norse navigation technology. Environmental agencies restrict access to areas that might contain Norse archaeological sites. Even the National Park Service has policies that effectively prevent investigation of Norse American evidence at sites under federal management. The coordination between these various suppression mechanisms suggests institutional conspiracy that extends far beyond coincidental shared interests. The systematic nature of the suppression, the coordination of responses across different institutions, and the consistency of pressure tactics reveal planning and organization that could only result from deliberate coordination. Recent Freedom of Information Act requests have revealed correspondence between government agencies, academic institutions, and commercial organizations that demonstrates explicit coordination of Norse American research suppression. These documents show systematic sharing of information about researchers' coordination of funding decisions and coordinated responses to potentially threatening research proposals. The financial stakes in maintaining the suppression system are enormous. The tourism industry throughout Eastern North America generates billions of dollars annually from historical attractions based on orthodox narratives about European contact with America. Theme parks, museums, historical sites, and educational tours all depend on established interpretations of American history that would require massive revision if Norse American evidence were acknowledged. Educational publishing represents another multi-billion-dollar industry that depends on maintaining orthodox historical narratives. Textbook companies have invested enormous sums in educational materials based on established chronologies of American history. Acknowledging extensive Norse exploration would require fundamental revision of curricula at costs that could bankrupt major educational publishers. The legal implications of acknowledging Norse American evidence could threaten resource extraction industries throughout the Americas. Mining companies, energy corporations, and agricultural businesses have obtained access to indigenous lands based on legal frameworks that assume European discovery and colonization created legitimate property rights. If Norse explorers established prior European claims to American territories, it could fundamentally alter the legal foundations of resource extraction throughout the Americas. Perhaps most significantly, the suppression system serves ideological interests that justify contemporary political and economic arrangements. The mythology of European discovery and indigenous primitiveness provides crucial support for colonial systems that continue to benefit European-descended populations at the expense of indigenous peoples. Acknowledging extensive Norse exploration would undermine narratives about the inevitability of European technological superiority and indigenous displacement. It would demonstrate that peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange were possible between Europeans and indigenous peoples, challenging justifications for the violence and displacement that characterized later European colonization. The systematic nature of Norse American research suppression reveals corruption that extends far beyond academic politics into the fundamental structures of knowledge production and dissemination in contemporary society. This corruption serves powerful economic and political interests that profit from maintaining particular interpretations of history regardless of what evidence actually reveals. But the suppression system has begun to show cracks that suggest its long-term sustainability may be threatened. Technological changes that democratize research tools and communication channels are making it increasingly difficult to maintain centralized control over controversial research. International collaboration is reducing the effectiveness of suppression systems that depend on national institutional coordination. Most significantly, growing public skepticism about institutional authority is creating audiences that are willing to consider evidence that challenges orthodox narratives. The same forces that have driven questioning of other institutional claims are beginning to focus attention on the systematic suppression of historical evidence. The suppression machine that has hidden Norse American evidence for over a century may finally be vulnerable to challenge by researchers and citizens who are willing to confront the powerful interests that have shaped our understanding of history to serve their own purposes. But dismantling this system will require understanding the full extent of the conspiracy that has hidden one of history's most significant exploration achievements from public view. As we're about to discover, the implications of Norse American exploration extend far beyond historical revision into fundamental questions about the nature of technological development, cultural exchange, and human exploration that could revolutionize our understanding of what medieval civilizations were capable of achieving. Standing on the windswept cliffs of Meadows, watching the North Atlantic, waves crash against granite shores that witnessed the first European footsteps in America over 1,000 years ago. The magnitude of what has been hidden from us becomes overwhelming. This isn't just about correcting historical dates or acknowledging earlier exploration. This is about recovering a lost chapter of human achievement that reveals capabilities and connections that fundamentally alter our understanding of medieval civilization. The complete timeline of Norse exploration that emerges from suppressed evidence spans over 4 centuries of sustained transatlantic contact. Beginning with Leif Erikson's initial voyage around 1000 CE, Norse expeditions established a network of settlements, trading posts, and resource extraction sites that extended from Newfoundland to the Great Lakes, from Hudson Bay to the Chesapeake Bay. These weren't desperate, isolated attempts at colonization. They were sophisticated operations conducted by people who possessed advanced navigation technology, detailed geographical knowledge, and extensive cultural connections with indigenous populations. The butternut shells at Meadows represent just one piece of evidence for systematic resource exploitation that covered thousands of miles and lasted for generations. The sunstone navigation technology that enabled this expansion represents perhaps the most significant technological achievement of the medieval period. Crystal navigation provided precision that exceeded early modern European capabilities and remains competitive with contemporary electronic systems. This technology enabled Norse expeditions to establish regular shipping routes, maintain supply lines across vast oceanic distances, and conduct systematic exploration with confidence that was impossible for later European expeditions. But sunstone navigation is just one component of a technological complex that reveals medieval capabilities far beyond what orthodox scholarship acknowledges. Norse metallurgy at Meadows demonstrates industrial sophistication that enabled large-scale tool production, weapon manufacturing, and construction projects. The quality of ironwork found at Norse American sites exceeds contemporary European standards and suggests technological innovations that were developed specifically for American operations. The linguistic evidence reveals cultural exchange between Norse explorers and indigenous populations that lasted for centuries. This wasn't the hostile contact that characterized later European colonization. The loanwords preserved in Native American languages describe peaceful trade relationships, technological transfer, and cultural integration that created hybrid societies throughout eastern North America. These hybrid societies developed unique cultural innovations that combined Norse technological capabilities with indigenous environmental knowledge. The result was a series of communities that possessed advantages unavailable to either purely European or purely indigenous populations. They had access to advanced metallurgy, superior navigation techniques, and sophisticated construction methods, combined with detailed knowledge of local ecosystems, seasonal patterns, and resource locations. The genetic evidence emerging from DNA studies of Native American populations confirms extensive Norse indigenous integration throughout the Great Lakes region. These genetic markers don't represent brief contact or isolated intermarriage. They suggest sustained population mixing over multiple generations that created stable communities with mixed European and indigenous ancestry. The geographical range of this genetic evidence corresponds exactly with the distribution of Norse loanwords in Native American languages and the locations where Norse artifacts have been discovered. This convergence of linguistic, genetic, and archaeological evidence creates an overwhelming case for extensive Norse settlement that extended far beyond anything Orthodox scholarship acknowledges. The climatic evidence reveals that favorable conditions for Norse expansion persisted throughout the medieval warm period, providing optimal sailing conditions, agricultural opportunities, and resource availability from approximately 900 to 1350 CE. These conditions coincide exactly with the period of Norse exploration described in suppressed documentary sources and confirmed by archaeological evidence. The collapse of these favorable conditions during the Little Ice Age explains the apparent abandonment of Norse American settlements without requiring the violent conflicts or cultural failures that Orthodox scholarship suggests. As sailing conditions deteriorated and agricultural productivity declined, maintaining transatlantic supply lines became increasingly difficult, eventually forcing abandonment of outlying settlements. But the knowledge and cultural innovations developed during centuries of Norse American exploration didn't disappear entirely. Indigenous communities throughout eastern North America preserved technological techniques, navigation knowledge, and cultural practices that reflected centuries of European contact. These innovations provided crucial advantages that enabled indigenous populations to resist later European colonization more effectively than Orthodox history acknowledges. The systematic suppression of this evidence serves contemporary interests that profit from maintaining particular narratives about pre-Columbian history. Tourism industries throughout eastern North America depend on established historical attractions that emphasize indigenous primitiveness and European technological superiority. Educational publishers have invested billions in materials based on Orthodox chronologies that would require complete revision if Norse American evidence were acknowledged. More significantly, acknowledging extensive Norse exploration undermines legal and moral justifications for European colonization that continue to benefit contemporary power structures. If Europeans and indigenous peoples successfully coexisted for centuries before Columbus, it demonstrates that the violence and displacement that characterized later colonization weren't inevitable results of cultural contact. The resource extraction industries that dominate contemporary American economic activity depend on legal frameworks that assume European discovery created legitimate property rights over indigenous territories. Acknowledging prior European settlement would complicate these frameworks, potentially threatening billions of dollars in commercial activity throughout the Americas. But the implications of Norse American exploration extend far beyond commercial and legal considerations into fundamental questions about human capabilities and cultural development. If medieval Scandinavians possessed navigation technology superior to early modern European methods, it suggests that technological development doesn't follow the linear progression that Orthodox scholarship assumes. If Norse explorers successfully integrated with indigenous populations to create hybrid societies that combine the advantages of both cultures, it demonstrates possibilities for cultural exchange that challenge assumptions about inevitable conflict between different civilizations. If Norse American settlements lasted for centuries and covered thousands of miles, it proves that medieval peoples were capable of exploration and colonization achievements that rival or exceed the accomplishments of later European expansion. These revelations force fundamental reconsideration of what medieval civilizations were capable of achieving. The Norse weren't primitive barbarians who stumbled onto America by accident. They were sophisticated explorers who possessed advanced technology, conducted systematic expeditions, and established extensive settlements that lasted for centuries. The suppression of this evidence represents one of history's most successful cover-ups, involving coordination between academic government and commercial institutions that have shaped public understanding of history to serve their own interests. But this suppression has robbed humanity of crucial knowledge about our own capabilities and achievements. Somewhere in the forests of eastern North America lie the ruins of settlements that could revolutionize our understanding of medieval technology and cultural development. Somewhere in archives around the world sit documents that could prove centuries of transatlantic contact. Somewhere in museum collections rest artifacts that could demonstrate capabilities that Orthodox scholarship claims were impossible. This evidence remains hidden, not because it lacks scientific validity, but because acknowledging it would threaten powerful interests that have invested enormous resources in maintaining particular interpretations of history. The question facing anyone who examines this evidence is whether we're willing to challenge these interests in pursuit of truth, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be for established institutions. The recovery of Norse American history isn't just about correcting historical errors or acknowledging earlier exploration. It's about reclaiming human achievements that demonstrate capabilities we didn't know we possessed and possibilities we didn't know existed. It's about challenging the institutional corruption that has hidden crucial knowledge from public view for over a century. But most importantly, it's about understanding that the official version of history isn't necessarily the true version. The systematic suppression of Norse American evidence reveals how powerful institutions can shape public understanding of the past to serve contemporary interests regardless of what evidence actually reveals. The question we must ask ourselves is what other aspects of history have been similarly distorted, and what other evidence remains hidden in archives, museums, and archaeological sites around the world, waiting for investigators brave enough to challenge institutional orthodoxy in pursuit of truth. In the secure facilities of defense contractors around the world, engineers are developing navigation systems based on crystalline technology that was perfected by Norse explorers over 1,000 years ago. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so revealing of the systematic corruption that has hidden this technology from public view for centuries. While academic institutions continue to dismiss Norse navigation as primitive coastal sailing, modern military forces are spending billions to develop applications of technology that the Vikings had already mastered. The continued classification of Sunstone research reveals why powerful institutions have been so determined to suppress Norse American evidence. This isn't just about protecting historical narratives or commercial interests. This is about controlling access to technological capabilities that could revolutionize modern navigation exploration and strategic operations. Recent advances in materials science have enabled the development of synthetic crystals that enhance the polarizing properties that made Iceland spar so effective for Norse navigators. These synthetic sunstones provide navigation accuracy that exceeds GPS systems and remains functional in electromagnetic warfare environments where electronic navigation fails. But this technology remains classified at levels that prevent civilian access, ensuring that the superior navigation capabilities that enabled Norse American exploration continue to serve military and commercial elites rather than benefiting humanity as a whole. The same institutional forces that suppressed historical evidence of Norse navigation are now suppressing modern applications that could democratize advanced navigation technology. The pharmaceutical industry has developed synthetic compounds designed to enhance human spatial orientation and navigation abilities based on studies of Norse navigation techniques. These compounds, derived from analysis of medieval Icelandic medical texts, provide cognitive enhancements that enable users to process polarized light information more effectively. But these pharmaceutical innovations remain restricted to military and intelligence applications, denied to civilian populations who might benefit from enhanced navigation capabilities. The systematic restriction of these technologies reveals the same pattern of elite control that has characterized the suppression of Norse American evidence throughout the modern period. The energy industry has discovered applications of crystalline technology that could revolutionize power generation and storage systems. The piezoelectric properties that made calcite crystals effective for navigation also enable efficient conversion between mechanical and electrical energy, providing possibilities for clean energy generation that could reduce dependence on fossil fuels. Yet research into these energy applications faces systematic obstruction from regulatory agencies and funding institutions that serve the interests of established energy companies. The same institutional forces that have hidden Norse technological achievements are now preventing modern applications that could threaten the commercial viability of existing energy systems. The implications extend beyond technological suppression into fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and power in contemporary society. The systematic suppression of Norse American evidence reveals how institutions can control public understanding of history to maintain their own advantages, regardless of how much that suppression harms broader human interests. Educational institutions that have spent decades dismissing Norse navigation capabilities now face the uncomfortable reality that their orthodox narratives have been proven wrong by modern technological developments. Rather than acknowledging their errors and revising their teachings, these institutions have chosen to maintain their suppression systems while quietly incorporating Norse innovations into classified research programs. Government agencies that have restricted access to archaeological sites containing Norse evidence now use those same sites for classified research into medieval technologies that could provide strategic advantages. The contradiction is profound evidence that is too dangerous to acknowledge publicly is valuable enough to support extensive secret research programs. Commercial organizations that have profited from maintaining orthodox historical narratives now face threats from technological innovations based on the same Norse achievements they have worked to suppress. The systematic nature of their suppression efforts reveals coordination and planning that extends far beyond protecting simple commercial interests. Religious institutions that have invested centuries in theological narratives about European expansion into pagan territories now confront evidence that undermines their foundational claims about divine guidance and cultural superiority. Rather than acknowledging the implications of Norse American evidence, these institutions have chosen to maintain their suppression while quietly revising their internal doctrines. The result is a system of institutional corruption that serves elite interests while denying the broader public access to knowledge and technologies that could benefit humanity as a whole. This corruption extends far beyond simple historical interpretation into active suppression of innovations that could improve human capabilities and reduce dependence on systems controlled by powerful institutions. But the Sunstone Conspiracy represents just one component of a much larger pattern of technological suppression that extends throughout contemporary society. The same institutional mechanisms that have hidden Norse navigation technology are being used to suppress other innovations that could threaten established commercial and political arrangements. Free energy technologies that could reduce dependence on fossil fuels face systematic suppression from regulatory agencies that serve energy industry interests. Medical innovations that could reduce dependence on pharmaceutical products encounter obstruction from agencies that profit from maintaining disease and disability. Transportation technologies that could reduce dependence on existing infrastructure are restricted by regulations that protect established commercial interests. The Norse American cover-up reveals how these suppression systems operate and why they persist despite their obvious harm to broader human interests. Institutional power depends on controlling access to knowledge and technology that could reduce dependence on systems that generate wealth and influence for elite groups. Understanding the Norse American conspiracy provides crucial insights into how similar suppression systems operate throughout contemporary society. The same coordination between academic government and commercial institutions that has hidden Norse exploration evidence is being used to suppress innovations that could revolutionize energy medicine, transportation, and communication. The question facing anyone who understands the scope of institutional corruption revealed by the Norse American cover-up is whether we're willing to challenge these systems regardless of the personal and professional risks involved. The systematic persecution of researchers who have attempted to expose the truth about Norse American exploration demonstrates the consequences of challenging institutional orthodoxy. But the alternative is accepting a world where crucial knowledge remains hidden from public view, where technological innovations that could benefit humanity are restricted to elite applications, and where historical truth is subordinated to the commercial and political interests of powerful institutions. The evidence we have examined reveals a pattern of systematic suppression that has hidden one of history's most significant exploration achievements for over a century. Norse American exploration represents capabilities and connections that fundamentally alter our understanding of medieval civilization, technological development, and cultural exchange. But more importantly, the suppression of this evidence reveals institutional corruption that extends throughout contemporary society, affecting not just our understanding of history, but our access to technologies and knowledge that could improve human life and reduce dependence on systems controlled by elite interests. The truth about Norse American exploration is dangerous, not because it threatens academic reputations or commercial profits, but because it reveals possibilities for human achievement and cultural cooperation that challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying contemporary power structures. This is why the evidence has been so systematically suppressed. This is why researchers who challenge orthodox narratives face career destruction. This is why technological innovations based on Norse achievements remain classified and restricted. The truth they fear isn't just about Vikings reaching America before Columbus. The truth they fear is about human capabilities. They want to keep hidden technologies they want to control and possibilities they want to deny. The choice facing each of us is simple. Do we accept the official version of history and continue to live within the limitations that institutional orthodoxy imposes? Or do we seek the truth about our own capabilities and achievements, regardless of what powerful forces might prefer to keep hidden? The truth is, out there preserved in archaeological sites that remain restricted, documented in archives that remain classified, and embedded in technologies that remain suppressed. But discovering that truth requires the courage to challenge institutions that have spent centuries building their power on foundations of ignorance and suppression. The question isn't whether the evidence exists. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. The question is whether we're willing to confront the powerful interests that have worked so hard to keep it hidden. The Vikings discovered America 5 centuries before Columbus established extensive settlements that lasted for generations, developed advanced technologies that remain classified to this day, and created possibilities for cultural exchange and human achievement that threaten the assumptions underlying contemporary power structures. This is the truth they fear. This is the knowledge they suppress. This is the evidence they hide. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is yours. But remember, once you understand the extent of institutional corruption that has shaped our understanding of history, you can never again simply accept official narratives without asking what interests they serve and what truths they might be hiding. The truth is out there, but it's up to you to find it.